why do I have to go back to the DMV to take this test? I've been driving all these years. Why I got to take it now? Like, we just see it as an inconvenience. All of us see tests typically through a pass and fail lens. Like, I see this with my kids. I saw it lately with Jubilee. She just got done taking her written permit test, right? 16 coming up, get my written permit test. You remember those days when you were so excited to drive? Right? That's the thing about having teenagers right now is you can say, hey, do you mind going to the store? And they're like, sure, I'll go to the store. They just want to drive. So you can say, hey, go anywhere. Oh, sure, I'll drive. Give them a couple of years, you ask them to go to the store. Do I have to? That costs too much money to go to the store. But right now, Jubilee just got done taking that written test, and so she studied. She got online, she studied, she called people to find out what was on the test. She wanted to make sure that she what? She passed the test. Or she wanted to make sure that she didn't fail the test. So she knew exactly how many she could get wrong until she would fail. How many can you get wrong? How many? 3? 7. 3. You get 7 now. Hey, that's a big curve. Big curve. You're just going to drive. And so, but she knows exactly how many is exactly the line going. Here's the line, pass or fail. Here's the line. She's not thinking 45,000 people die in a car accident every year. She's not thinking $41 billion is spent on automobile accidents. She's not thinking, I'm about to drive this car that can easily destroy my life. She's thinking pass or fail. Just because like you and me, we think pass or fail. See, the problem is God doesn't look at tests like pass or fail. He doesn't see tests like pass or fail. He doesn't look at them as something you and I should just look to push through. He doesn't look at them as a hoop. He doesn't look at them as inconvenience. He looks at them as an opportunity. God's view in the test for you and for me is always to pass, never to fail. See, but you and I still have this tendency, every time we have a test, we still have this tendency that we are looking to pass or fail. God's going, I just want to see you pass. That means God's purpose in the test is to pass you. God's purpose in the test is to show you what you're lacking, to show me what I'm lacking. God's purpose in the test is to expose my heart. God's purpose in the test is to make himself large. God's purpose in the test is to remind you that you can't pass it on your own. See, but so much of our idea of a test is simply, I just want to push through it. I just want to get it behind me. And that's not God's purpose. When I was a kid, I used to see this shot like this coming up. I don't know if you remember this when you were a kid. This was back in the day before you had like a remote control and you had to walk up to the TV and turn it. And then when you walked up to the TV, every once in a while you'd be watching TV and this thing would pop up like this. And then all of a sudden there'd be this sound, you remember? It would go, eh. And then after the there'd be this voice. The voice would come on and say, this is a test. This is a test of the emergency broadcast system. This is only a what? Test. I remember that still today. This is only a test. And then the voice would say, if this was a real emergency, you would be informed what to do. That's what God's doing right now. He's informing you. He's informing me what to do. Everything in life is only a test. The test is never to fail you. The test is never to fail me. The test is always that Christ would be glorified. The test is always that God would show me what I'm lacking. That's the test that he has for you today. So here's the reality. You and I, as God's image bearers, are either right now about to enter a test. Do you understand that? Today, you are going to start the test if you're not already in it. Because either you're starting the test, you are either in the test, or you're just coming out of the test. That's life. You are either about to start a test somehow today in some way. You are either in one right now, or you are coming out of one only to do what? Come back in one again. And it's only a test. Not to fail you, but that Christ would be glorified in it. That God would be seen through you in it. It's only a test. And now I say that because this is what chapter 43 and 44 are all about. Genesis chapter 43 and 44 are simply about a test. a test of really three different people. There's the test of Jacob that you're going to see in verses 1 and 2, or 1 through 6. There's the test of Joseph, which you'll see in verses 26 through 31. And then there's the test of Judah and his brothers, which you see kind of throughout both the chapters if you read them this week. But it's only a test. So here's my goal. My goal today is we're going to try to work through the first test, and we'll see how far we get. I think we should have enough time, actually, to get us through all three of these tests. But we're going to look at all these tests. So let's go Genesis chapter 43. Actually, go to chapter 42 first, because the test that Jacob faces really starts in chapter 42. And Jacob's first test starts with getting news that he doesn't want to hear. Let me say that again. Jacob's test starts when Jacob gets news that he doesn't want to hear. If you remember last week, the brothers finally come back from Egypt. They've met Joseph, but they don't know it's Joseph. And they got some grain. They came back, but they came back one brother short. Do you remember? Who was the brother? Simeon. They came back one brother short. Joseph, in his wisdom, keeps Simeon there, says, hey, I want you to go back. I want you to get Benjamin. Show me that you're not spies. Bring him back here. So they show back up to their father Jacob in verse 35. Look with me in chapter 42. It says, and now it came about that they were empty their sacks, and behold, every man's bundle of money was in the sack. And their father saw their bundle of money, and they were dismayed. And their father Jacob said to them, you have bereaved me of my children. Joseph is no more, Simeon is no more, and you would take Benjamin, and all these things are against me. So that Jacob is just like you and me. He hears news that he doesn't want to hear. Here they are. They come back from Egypt, but they come back not empty-handed. They come back with grain. They even come back with what? Not just grain, but what? Their own money. They got free grain. Like a program that Egypt had set up. Get your own free stuff coming right here, and they get it, but they come back empty-handed, and since they come back without Simeon, and all of a sudden Jacob says, you have bereaved me. All these things are against me. He does the same thing in chapter 43. Look at 43. It says, now the famine in the land was severe in the land, and it came about that they would finish eating the grain that they had brought from Egypt. And their father said to them, go back and buy us some food. So they come back. They want to take Benjamin back with them, but Jacob can't let Benjamin go yet. So Benjamin says no, or Jacob says, no, we're not going to go. Let's stay here and eat what we have. They eat what they have. Some time passes in chapter 43, and they can no longer wait because now they're getting rid of all the food that they brought back from Egypt. Verse 3, and Judah spoke to him and said, however, saying, the man solemnly warned us, you shall not see the face unless your brother is with you. If you send your brother with us, then we'll go down and we'll buy food. But if you do not send him, we will not go down. For the man said to us, you shall not see the face unless your brother is with you. Look at verse 6. And Israel said, why did you treat me so badly by telling the man whether you still had another brother? How fast Jacob, just like you and me, when he hears news he doesn't want to hear, how fast he makes it all about him. Do you notice? He makes everything in this story about him. He says in chapter 42, you have bereaved me. Why have you done this to me? Everything's against me. Like somehow the boys are in charge of the famine. Like somehow the boys are in charge of the man in Egypt. Like somehow the boys are in charge of all these things. All Jacob sees in the midst of this news that he doesn't want to hear, all he sees is life surrounded about himself. And he says, why have you done this to me? And then he says in chapter 43, why do you treat me this way? How fast he forgets that all the promises of God are what? Yes and amen. How fast he forgets these things. In Charles Swindoll's book on this subject, he points out three things that I thought were key. And so if you're taking notes, he says every time we get news that we don't want to hear. So think about it in a time in your life when you got news that you did not want to hear. You got a phone call that you did not want to receive. You got a message, you got an email that you did not want to read. You got news that you did not want to hear. You got news that didn't fit the narrative you thought it was going to fit. Your life's going this way. All of a sudden, you get news that your life is going to go this way. What do you do in the midst of that news? Does that make sense? Now, that's what Jacob's doing. He all of a sudden, he has to receive news that's going to change his narrative. He has to receive news that's going to change his direction. And Swindoll says three things take place with you and me. He says, number one, we tend to respond negatively, not positively. He says, most of us, when we get news we don't want to hear, we tend to respond negatively, not positively. Again, look at Jacob. He says in chapter 42, in verse 36, all these things are against me. His sons just brought back food. His sons just brought back money. His sons just let them know that there was stuff in Egypt, and yet in his mind, he says, all these things are against me. In verse 6, after the food was eaten, and the brothers said, hey, we need to go down, remember Israel says, why do you treat me so badly? Why do you treat me so badly? You and I have a tendency, when we hear news that we don't like, is to automatically go negative. Think about it. Joseph doesn't go, what a great opportunity for God to work. Joseph doesn't go, hey, I'm so glad you guys made it back. Joseph doesn't go, hey, this is awesome. God brought some grain and some money with us. Joseph, like you and me, when we hear news we don't want, we automatically tend to go negative. Number two, he says, we tend to view problems only horizontal, not vertical. You and I have a tendency to view problems horizontally, not vertical. Let me explain. When you and I begin to hear news we don't want to hear from the doctor, we don't want to hear from someone close to us, we don't want to hear from our boss, we tend to have this ability to only see it horizontal. We never see it vertical, meaning this, we only see through human perspective. We tend to see only what we can change, only what we can manipulate, only what we can move. We only see it through that area. That's seeing it horizontal. So we get overwhelmed because we can't see it, because the Bible says we see things dimly anyways, but we get overwhelmed because we only see what we can grab onto. We only see what we know we can change or that we can do to fix it. And so we start to act negatively. Or when we start to see things horizontally, all we begin to do is blame shift. Do you notice what Joseph does? Why did you do this to me? They had nothing to do with it, and yet because Jacob only sees it horizontally, he's blaming his sons for doing something. Matter of fact, he says, why did you tell them? What he's saying is, why didn't you just lie? Why did you even tell them? Why not just lie? Because he's seeing things horizontally. And when we see things horizontally, we typically always only see the worst case scenario, don't we? When you and I start to look horizontally, like this is a person who goes to the doctor and they find out that they might have this sort of cancer, and that person runs to the internet and searches for 12 hours long this one little spot on their body and what it might be and what it's going to look like, and if they have it, this is what the end's going to be. And by that whole time, they're overwhelmed because they went worst case scenario, only to go back to the doctor and say, hey, we were wrong with your antidote, we were wrong with it, you don't have anything, you're fine. Oh, but how many times do we jump to worst case scenario, don't we? Anytime you and I jump to worst case scenario, our view is horizontal, not vertical. Our view is on the world, not on who God is. And that's what we have a tendency to do. We tend to panic and make one bad decision after another. Do you remember Saul in 1 Samuel chapter 13? Remember the guy Saul? He was a king, the first king of Israel. And Samuel comes down to Saul and says, Saul, you're going to be king. I want you to go to Gilgal, and I want you to wait 7 days. 7 days I want you to wait. 7 days I want you to wait, and I'm going to come down, and then you're going to see a victory that God's going to do. And so Saul goes down. He waits for 7 days. He's waiting. The Philistine army is starting to gather, and Saul is waiting, and he's watching, and he's waiting, and he's watching. And all of a sudden, the seventh day comes, but there's no Samuel. And so Saul, the Bible says, Saul, the people started to disappear, and he thought to himself, what must I do to keep everybody here? Samuel already told him what to do. What was it? Just wait. Just be patient. Saul couldn't be patient, and so what did Saul do? You remember the story? sacrifice out. He has a sacrifice. He makes himself to be a priest. And Samuel shows up right after the sacrifice was done and says, Saul, what have you done? You've put yourself in a place that God has never called you to be. The kingdom would have been yours, but now the kingdom is gone. I wonder how many times you and I, in the midst of seeing things horizontally, we tend to take things in our own hand, and God is going, just slow play this, be patient so you can see my victory. You could see what I'm going to do, but instead, what do? We want to take it in our own hands. We want to kind of work it out our own way. The sad thing, that's what Jacob does. He doesn't see it as an opportunity for God to work. He doesn't remember the past that God has done. He doesn't look at Romans 8, not that he had Romans 8:28, that God's going to work all things out for good. He goes horizontal. He misses. The third thing, he says we tend to resist what's new. So not only do we think negative, not positive, not only do we think horizontal, not vertical, but you and I constantly have this ability to resist what is new. See, when all of a sudden you're going this direction, all of a sudden you hear the news that says, hey, we're going to go this direction, our tendency is to fight that change. Would you agree? Most of us have a tendency to fight any kind of change that changes the way that we think things should go. Because you and I are people of habit, are we not? Like I said before, I can tell who's here by where you sit. We're not even 3 months into hanging out together, 4 months in, and again, the same people sit the same place every time, just about. Every once in a while, there's an outliner who decides, I'm gonna venture in this area. I don't know. I'm gonna venture over here. I'm gonna see if they bite. But we have this tendency to walk in, and even when you leave here, most of you got a routine of where you're gonna go eat. Do you not? I'm gonna go to the hangar. I'm gonna go to the airplane place, and you know what you're gonna get, right? You go to the same place. You eat the same thing, the same time. Because you're people of habit. And so when God invades that habit and wants you to change, our tendency is to push back against it. We push back against it. And yet, we understood the nature of God, but we not understand that God is about change. In Philippians chapter 1, Paul says this, be confident in this very thing, who began a good work in you will carry it out. Meaning that God's a God of change. That he starts you one place, and that he moves you someplace. In Ephesians chapter 4, Paul says, you were taught in regard to the former way of life to put off the old self, being corrupt and deceitful in desire, to be made new in your new attitude of your mind. I mean that you and I, that God is constantly making things new. In Psalm chapter 40, verse 1 through 3, the psalmist says this, be patient, wait patiently for the Lord, for he inclined me, and I heard, and he heard my cry. He brought me up out of the pit of destruction, out of the miry clay. And he set my feet upon the rock, making my footsteps firm. And he put a new song in my mouth, and a song of praise to our God. And many will see it and fear, and you will trust in the Lord. The psalmist says that God is longing in a sense to put a new song in your heart, a new song in my heart, a new song that declares who he is. And typically that happens for you and me. And yet there's something inside of us. As soon as that change comes, I seem to push back against the idea that God might want me to do something. That God might be calling me to do something. Jacob was that guy. He didn't want to change. He didn't want to change. He's 120 years old. He doesn't want to change. He likes his life. He likes his routine. And yet God would say, Jacob, I got something else for you. You're going to have to leave here and go down to Egypt. I'm going to use you down here in a way that you never see. I'm going to use you in Egypt in such a way that you're going to give a testimony of that. The whole nation's going to shut down because of this. Because he's willing to. Yeah, I think all of us tend to function this way. See, some of you, when you hear the news that you don't want, you automatically go negative. You automatically think worst case scenario. Which means you're not thinking biblically, you're thinking worldly. Which means you're not thinking horizontal. Or you're thinking horizontal, not vertical. You're not thinking, hey, I wonder what God's going to do with this. I wonder what God might do with this. I wonder how God's going to change this. We have this typically. Or maybe you just resist completely. See, each of you probably function in one way or another. I know for me, I function in number 2. Every time, for me, I'm a very orderly person. I know it doesn't seem like it at times, but I am very orderly in the sense of like I have routines. I'm up at the same time every morning. I know exactly how long it takes to get my toast in the toaster, walk out, feed the dog, put the Keurig on, flip my toast, walk back, get the peanut butter, walk back, get the jelly, get the toast out, sit down my peanut butter jelly, sit down at my chair, same cup of coffee every morning, exactly the same. If you get me out of that routine, I don't know how to function. I get all nervous. It's not my routine. Got to have my routine, and that's me. And so when things don't take place for me, I have a tendency to be the one who only sees horizontal. I only see worst case scenario. I have a tendency to really become very negative and can't believe this is happening to me. And it's all about me and my world. I was telling the group on Thursday, a couple of years ago, we had a chance to go down to Catalina. For 4 years straight or so, we went down to Catalina. This group would call me down there to teach, and I would teach, and they would pay for my family to go down to Catalina on the beach. InterVarsity, we would do Bible studies. I would teach high school and junior hires the whole week, and we would paddleboard, and we would kayak, and literally your little tent was an awesome tent that you slept in. It was a tent, but it was a cool tent, and you could hear the water for a week. We did this every single year. And one year, after the great week of ministry of people and sharing, we were getting ready to leave. And I'm leaving the parking lot of Long Beach. I'm driving out of the parking lot. All of a sudden, I hear this. And I look down in the back of my car, and my tires are flat. And so I pull over the side of the road. I look at the tire, and it's just kind of all failing out. I walk back in. I open the door up, and I tell Shinny, I can't believe it got a flat. Just ruined the vacation right there's my flat. Like, I went off for like 20 minutes on how this flat just destroyed everything that God was doing. Like, now I was going to be late getting home. Now this is going to cost me money for a new tire, even though God just paid for 5 people to go to Catalina for a week. I'm worried about the $75 for the new tire and how it's going to make me stick in traffic, and I can't believe it, and I don't know where the tire's at, and I have to Google it. At the same time, right in front of this fountain in Long Beach, I don't know if you've been there, where every 15 minutes there's like a water show, and this thing just shoots off, and there's music and everything, and that's where we got stuck. We didn't get stuck on the freeway. We didn't get stuck nowhere, in between of nowhere. We got stuck literally coming out of the parking lot where I had a AAA card to call them to come and change it, and I'm sitting there forever complaining. Worst case scenario. This is the worst vacation ever. Never come back here again. Over a tire. Seeing how fast, I wonder how many things that we complain about, God's going to go, that was like a tire. You're complaining about a tire. What are you doing? You don't even see what I'm doing. You don't even recognize what I'm doing. Does that make sense? See, for you and me, we have to get off the horizontal. We got to get on the vertical. We got to remember that God is in control of all things, His providence, and that none of these things should move you. Whatever is in your life shouldn't move you to the point of despair where you can't function. Now, should it move you to a point of despair where you got to reach back into God and say, God, I need your answer? You bet. God, I need you to speak to me? You bet. God, I need other people around me? You bet. But never overwhelmed by it. Jacob didn't respond to that. You know what the sad thing about the story so far, too? If you look at, before we jump into the next one, look at verse 18 of chapter 43. In verse 16, it says, Joseph saw that Benjamin was with them, and he said to his house steward, bring them in here into the house. And they saw the animal. They made ready that they dined with him. The men did as Joseph had said, and they brought them in. So they come back to Egypt. Joseph sees his brothers, and he wants to have a dinner with them or a lunch with them. So he brings them into his house, all of his brothers. And in verse 18, and the men were afraid because they brought them into Joseph's house. Here's the sad thing about the sons of Jacob, is the sons of Jacob respond just like their father does. So the sons of Jacob respond just like their father. Listen to me, parents, real quick. I guarantee you, your kids will respond. If you're that person who only sees things horizontal, your kids are going to check. If you're that parent who only sees the negative, your kids are. If you're the parent who resists change, your kid will resist change. They're watching. They're watching me. How does my parent respond when faith is challenged? What's my parents respond when news comes in? When the email shows up? When the phone call comes? My kids are watching that. If I become anxious and overwhelmed, I guarantee you, your kids will follow suit, will be anxious. There's some part for you and me, we have to recognize where we're at. We can't continue to always respond horizontal. Now, is this going to be a struggle forever? Yeah, it is. Just like Jacob. So I don't want you to get overwhelmed by yourself going, I'm a terrible person. I just can't. You're functioning just like Jacob did. And he's 120 years old, and he wrestled with God, so you're okay. Right? So you're going to keep moving in that. What about the next one? The next trial. Oh, one more thing before. And here's the thing I think we don't recognize is you and I are always going to take one trial into the next. Here's what I mean. Why does Jacob not want to let Benjamin go? Like the brothers come back and say, hey, all we have to do is take Benjamin down to Egypt, get some grain, come back, we're golden, we're good, we'll survive, everything's fine, Dad. That's all we have to do. It's a 1 week trip there, 1 week trip back, we're good. Well, why does Jacob not want Benjamin to go? Because he lost Joseph 22 years ago. 22 years, Jacob is carrying this trial, carrying this thing into the next trial. You and I will always carry one trial into the next trial. So that's either really good or really, really bad. Let me explain. Like the example of David. So David goes down to visit his brothers. Remember the story in 1 Samuel. David goes down to visit his brothers, and his brothers are in a fight with the army of the Philistines. He goes down, and he hears that the Philistines are calling out the living God. And David goes, why aren't you guys killing this guy? What's the deal? And David says, I'll kill him. Remember the response David got when he said, I'll kill him? Remember what Saul said? Saul said, David, you're too young. You're too small. Goliath has been fighting from his youth. You are but a youth. And then David's response was what? Do you remember? I have fought a lion and a bear. And the Lord delivered me from the lion. The Lord delivered me from the bear. The Lord will certainly deliver me from the Philistine. David takes his trial of the lion and the bear that he saw the Lord deliver him, and he moves that trial into the next trial of Goliath, saying, I saw the deliverance. I know God's going to deliver me here. See how that works? That's positively taken one trial into the next trial. The negative idea of that works, like in Mark chapter 6. Go to Mark chapter 6. In Mark chapter 6, the disciples see Jesus feed 5,000 people. Pick with me in verse 45. They see him feed all these people with some loaves and some bread. And it says in verse 45, immediately Jesus, so after he feeds the 5,000, he sends the disciples away, right? He says immediately Jesus made his disciples get into a boat and go ahead of them to the other side of Bethsaida. And he himself was sending the crowd away. And after bidding them farewell, he left on the mountain to pray. And when evening had come, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and it was alone on the land. He was alone on land. Seeing them straining at the oars and the wind against them, it was about the fourth watch of the night. So here's the disciples. They had a long day with Jesus. Jesus says, hey, I want you to get in this boat. I want you to go to the other side. Jesus leaves them in the boat, and he goes to the mountain to pray. He's watching them the whole time. The fourth night of the night, which is like 12 hours later, they're still doing what? They're still rowing. They're still rowing. They're still rowing. They can't get across this lake. In verse 40, it's 49. But when they saw Jesus walking on the sea, verse 48, seeing them straining on the oars and the wind against them, about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea, and he intended to pass them by. But they saw him walking on the sea, and they supposed that he was a ghost. And they cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them, and he said, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped, and they were utterly astonished. Verse 52 is the key. For they had not gained insight from the incidents of the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. You see, Mark tells us here that the disciples just saw Jesus have such power that he took some loaves and some fish and he multiplied it to feed thousands. And they get into the boat and they start to row to the other side and they can't get to the other side and they become overwhelmed and they see this person walking on water and they don't see clearly because they're overwhelmed because they're thinking horizontal. They're overwhelmed because they're thinking horizontal because they only can work on what they can work with. They don't know it's Jesus, and he steps on the boat and everything calms down. And he says, "You are overwhelmed because you did not gain insight into the loaves of fish." They never got, like David did, that, hey, God saved me from the lion, God saved me from the bear, certainly he's going to save me from here. They didn't gain insight. Because they didn't get insight, they became overwhelmed. Most of the time that you and I are overwhelmed because we haven't gained insight. We haven't taken that last trial into the next picture. The disciples are a lot like you and me because they do the same thing in Mark chapter 8. Go to Mark chapter 8. In Mark chapter 8, look at verse 11. Again, Jesus feeds thousands, and then the Pharisees come to him, came out and began to argue with him in verse 11 of chapter 8, speaking to him the sign of the heavens to test him. And sighing deeply in his spirit, he said, "Why do you, this generation, speak a sign? Truly I say to you, there is no sign but given but generation." Verse 13, leaving them, he again embarked with them and went away on the other side. So he's with his disciples, and they had forgotten to take some bread. And they did not have more than one loaf in the boat with them. And he was giving orders to them, saying, "Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." And they began to discuss with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus answers, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you discuss the fact that you have no bread? Do you not see and understand? Do you not have a hardened heart? Having eyes you do not see, and having ears you do not hear, and you do not understand. When I broke the 5 loaves and the 5,000, how many baskets of pieces did they pick up?" And they said 12. And he said, "When I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets did we pick up?" They said 7. And he was saying to them, "Do you not understand?" Jesus was pointing out to the disciples, just like he points out to you and me, we have to be a people who learn to take one trial in. We have to be able to remember the things God has done here, so when there's something else happens here, that victory is seen. Does that make sense? And yet, so many times when we don't, our heart gets hardened. We only see things horizontal. Now, what about Joseph's trial? Quickly, go back to Genesis. We'll wrap it up with these two real quickly. Joseph's trial starts in verse 26. It says Joseph came home and he brought him. So Joseph sees his brothers. He invites them to his house. He's going to have lunch with his brothers after 22 years of not seeing them, really of connecting with them. And Joseph came home and he brought them into his house to present them with their hand, and he bowed down and bowed to the ground before him. So they bowed down to him, and he answered them about their welfare, and he said, "Is your father well, of whom you spoke? Is he alive?" And they said, "Your servant, your father, is well. He is still alive." And they bowed down in homage. And he lifted up his eyes, and he saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son. And he said, "Is this your youngest brother to whom you spoke?" And he said, "May God be gracious to you, my son." Verse 30, and Joseph hurried out. He was deeply stirred over the brother. And he sought a place to weep. And he entered in the chamber, and he wept there. And he washed his face, and he came out. And he controlled himself, and he said, "Serve the meal." See, Joseph's trial is a lot different than Jacob's trial. Jacob hears news that he doesn't want to hear, and he responds only horizontal. He responds negative. And it takes God to force him to move him by faith. Joseph's trial, he's longing for this moment. He's been longing for this moment for 22 years to get reconnected with his brothers. And all of a sudden it's here, and his emotions start to overwhelm him. So you and I, sometimes one of our biggest trials is our emotions, and how fast we allow them to dictate what we do. We become overwhelmed by them, May that be depression or anger or fear or anxiety, whatever it is, those emotions begin to run up. And emotions in themselves aren't bad or good. They're a gift. Emotions are a gift that God gives us so we can see what's inside of our heart. But to be run by those emotions is where we get into trouble. And Joseph has all these emotions, and yet in verse 31 it says that he washed his face and he came out and he controlled. He controlled himself. He doesn't dwell on them, but he controls himself. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 7, another lesson or test that we should learn is we've got to be a people who learn how to control our emotions. Not be pushed one way or the other with them. 2 Timothy 2, 7 says, "For God has not given us a spirit of timidity, but of power and love and discipline." In Proverbs chapter 20, verse 5, it says, "The purpose of a man's heart is a deep water, but the one who has insight draws it out." Meaning you and I, our people, are always going to be full of emotion. So the point is how do I draw that emotion? How do I know that emotion is right, healthy, and good? Does that make sense? And so I think Joseph here gives us some wisdom. Number one, he gets space. He steps back from his brothers and says, let me get some space here in my emotions. It's always a good thing for you and me. And number two, I think he never views emotions as fact. Listen to me. Your emotion and my emotion isn't a fact. Just because I feel some way doesn't make that to be true. God's word is what's going to make it true. Investigation of that situation is going to make it true. Because I feel it doesn't make it true. So I have to watch, always making my emotions the truth. And we're in a weird culture right now where we say things all the time like, you've made me feel this way. Like somehow I control how you feel. Joseph isn't going to allow anyone to control how he feels. Only the Lord is going to control how he feels. So he's able to step back away from it and control his emotions. Here's a good way to indicate your emotion. Is your emotion about your kingdom or God's kingdom? When you get angry, is your anger about your kingdom or is it about God's kingdom? When you get depressed, are you depressed because of your kingdom or God's kingdom? Every emotion comes. If I can run it through that lens, is it God's kingdom or my kingdom that's causing this emotion that's going to help me dictate how I handle that emotion? Go, no, I don't need to act that way. I don't need to respond that way. That's not God's. And that's huge for you. Lastly, let's look at real quick Jacob's test or Judah's test. Judah's test comes to us in chapter 43. And look with me real quick in verse 33. Remember the story. They come and eat lunch. Joseph hides his emotions. He sends all his brothers back to Canaan. He sends them back to go to his dad. But he sends, remember, he takes a cup, a silver cup, and he sticks it in Benjamin's bag. And after they leave, he sends his second in control to go down there and chase after them and say, hey, which one of you stole the cup? Now all the brothers get off the donkey and go, hey, no one stole anything. Anyone who steals anything, that person's your servant. I guarantee you no one steals anything. Now Joseph's doing this because he wants to see if their brother's heart has changed. So he knows what he's doing. He purposely puts it in Benjamin's bag because he wants Benjamin to get caught, because he wants Benjamin to be brought back, and he wants to see, will any of the brothers stick up for Benjamin? Will any of the brothers say, no, it wasn't Benjamin? Will anyone ever have a voice to help their brother out? Because 22 years ago, they didn't have a voice to help Joseph out. And so he's doing this purposely, remember? And he does it, and Benjamin comes back, and remember the story. Out of all the brothers that stick up, who's the one that sticks up? Judah. He recognizes it's the test. Will he stick up? Will he speak truth? Will he say what's needed to be said? And in verse 16, chapter 43, Judah said, what can we say to my Lord? What can we speak, and how can we justify ourselves? God has found out our iniquity of our servants. Behold, we are the Lord's slaves, both we and the one in the possession of the cup be found. But he said, far be it from me to do this, for the man whose possession of the cup shall be found shall be a slave. So Judah steps up and says, hey, we're all slaves. But we know it. We'll all come back. And then the guy says, no, just the one has to be the slave, just Benjamin. And then verse 18, and Judah approached him and said, "Oh, my Lord, may your servant please speak a word in my Lord's ear, and do not be angry with your servant, for you are equal with Pharaoh." My Lord asked his servant, saying, "Have you a father or a brother?" And so he begins to tell Joseph the story about how Joseph had died, though, and he really didn't die, and how his father was devastated by it. And then in verse 33, here's what Jacob says, "Now therefore please let your servant remain instead, and a lad a slave to my Lord, and let the lad go up with his brothers. For how shall I go up to my father if the lad is not with me? For the fear that I see the evil that would overtake my father." Finally, Judah gets it. Judah's willing to lay down his own life. That was the test. Or was Judah willing to lay down his own life for his brother? That was going to be his test. That's the same test for you and me. Are we willing to lay down our life for those who are close to us? Are we willing to be like Christ, who laid down his life for us, even those around us who don't even seem like they even are willing for it or even want it? That's what Judah does. See, that the test isn't a pass or fail. The test that you're in, the test that you're going to be in, the test that you're not a pass or fail. Look at me real quick. Because you're going to fail. But the test is to show you what's lacking in you. The test is to remind you how glorious God is. Does that make sense? Remember, it's only a test. Only a test. Not to fail you. Lord, I do thank you again for today. Thank you for your word. I do pray that you would help us to be people who don't try to sidestep the test. Lord, but we're able to walk in it and trust that you are able to do exceedingly abundantly. Lord, I pray you help us to have a vertical view. Lord, teach us what that looks like this week as we study chapter 45. Teach us what it looks like to see things in the view of but God. God is able to do exceedingly abundantly. Father, we love you. Thank you. All right, God bless. We'll see you next week. Don't forget to sign up for the carnival if you want to help out in any way, shape, or form.